And now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Alex Sproule. Alex grew up attending RE and services at Don Heights. Like many others in her generation, she is not currently an active member of a congregation. However, the Unitarian Universalist values and principles are still part of her identity and are woven through her work and choices as an artist, educator, and human being. What can it mean to be a UU if you are not participating in the religious institution itself? Alexandra will speak to her personal journey, the practices, communities, and work that have influenced her identity and nurtured her spirituality as a Unitarian Universalist. Alex, so good to see you.
So great to be here. So great to be at Don Heights. As Lorna said in that introduction, I grew up at Don Heights. You can see photo evidence here. That's me in the hat on the left, with some other people here you might recognize, including my brother, Michael. I haven't been a member or even a semi-regular attendee of a Unitarian Universalist service for over a decade, but I still call myself a Unitarian. I know relatively recently, Linda Plumpton did a service and spoke about how growing up in RE has influenced her life. And part of her title was the lapsed Unitarian. And I loved that phrasing, but I realized that I don't feel lapsed. I feel like I practice Unitarian Universalism in my own way. I feel more like a nomadic UU. And so I took that as part of my title. Because in my adult life, I feel like I've carried the principles and spiritual grounding of myself and my internal UU chalice flame into other extremely kindred spiritual communities at different points in time. I mean, one of the most marvelous things about Unitarian Universalism is right in the principles of free and responsible search for truth and meaning. There's just so much that's not prescribed, and certainly Unitarianism is an invitation to commit to a set of principles and a way of being in the world, but there's also so much you define personally as a congregation or as a group of congregations. And because so little is prescribed, I sometimes wonder when I tell people, I'm Unitarian, what do I mean? Whether I could risk misusing the identity. I mean, I'd say growing up UU is more than enough to be included in my dad's UU A to Z series as a historical figure. But, what does it mean to be alive now and to say I'm a Unitarian Universalist, but outside of the way that I grew up practicing it, which was attending a congregation? I don't have an answer, and I would expect people to have different opinions on it. But today I can talk about what growing up in UU and RE meant to me, and why I still love to call myself a Unitarian, how my own spiritual needs have evolved over the course of my 20s, and some of the really wonderful communities that I got to park myself in my internal flame in over the years. So I want to start at the beginning. You can see, some photos here. My parents, John and Lydia, started attending UU and bringing my brother and I to Don Heights when we were pretty young. I think maybe 4 and 5 or somewhere around there. My mom kindly found these photos actually from our, what we have from those years. We were there for the last years that Don Heights was in the shared church space that was in this photo. I have, dim memories of this space. I remember quite a lot of other children, and including some older children who were in the youth group. I remember a room that I thought had a lot of comfy chairs, and as through my childhood sitting in the service, listening to the story for the kids before RE started. The mitten tree, which as a kid I found extremely baffling, but also very entertaining. And, just a group of very kind adults who would always ask me how I was. I also vividly remember a performance from Chris White, whose song Nothing Rhymes with Orange played on constant repeat in our house for at least a year after that. And I'm sure you'll recognize many people from these photos, many memories. When we moved to Edwards Gardens, the RE was getting smaller by then. Michael and I were sometimes the only kids there. And I think Haley and Jacob Karoom, also in this photo, who were there often, were sometimes the only ones as well. But there were other wonderful kids who were there with us some of the time. My mom ran RE for a while, as did our babysitter from down the street, Claire, a little bit in the community. And when Don Heights moved to the current location that it's in, Michael and I were teenagers. And by then we didn't do RE anymore. We attended service. RE dwindled. As a teenager, there was a year where I myself took care of the kids who would come to the service when there were kids. And, I remember so many dream auctions, coffee houses, and events like the murder mysteries my parents would hold at our house that were big events in our household. There's a lot of, activities we did in RE and time we spent in RE that stuck with me through the years. Hearing folk tales, doing art, discussing the principles, singing, doing pageants, participating in service in little ways like here. I don't know what we were doing with the instruments, but yeah, it's come with me through the years. Nowadays, I'm primarily an educator and an artist, but that can look like a lot of different things in my life. I almost skipped this, sorry, because after I finished high school, the summer before, not only was like RE a big influence in my life, but also, I looked up also just the influence from all of the wonderful members of Don Heights, some of whom are here today and I haven't seen in years. There were so many gifts I received from seeing hearing what people shared in joys and concerns, and in the announcements, what the adults around me were up to, but also being encouraged to take certain opportunities. This is from the Pastors for Peace caravan that I did after I finished high school, because Fred insisted it'd be an amazing experience for me. And it was. And this is just a photo with one of the people I did gold mine at a Unitarian summer camp that same summer with. It was the first time that I had gone out and done a program with Unitarian youth outside of Don Heights. And it was amazing and very impactful. And I went off into my undergrad with just a huge influence from this community. Nowadays, I am primarily an educator and artist, but that looks like a lot of different things in my life. I tutor one-on-one and in small groups. I work on audio storytelling. I write. My first book of short stories, Wormhole, came out last year. I edit a small press. I met with a career counselor once in my early 20s, and she made a very helpful comment that I seem more interested in work that was part of a certain movement or purpose than like a certain job. And it was a helpful insight that's stuck with me, because through my 20s, I find that I'm happy doing almost any job that I'm capable of doing, as long as it feels purpose aligned. And so it's been really important to try and constantly come back to my purpose, constantly come back to that sense of purpose, and try and find the language to articulate it to myself and the people around me. Not everything we do is purpose aligned, but it's a constant exercise articulating it and trying to live it. And I find that when I think about what my purpose is, I so often come back to UU language and principles that I grew up with. I often, when I'm discussing my purpose, come back to the first and seventh principles, you know, a purpose of honoring the inherent worth and dignity of every person, respecting the interdependent web of all existence of which we are part, and seeing that reflected in the systems that we live in, which certainly don't always honor everyone's worth and interconnectedness. You know, it's not easy. It's there's so many layers to living this reality. And I come back to this language. I come back to certain UU small traditions, like opening a space of reflection for myself or a group by lighting a chalice or dropping a pebble in the water, of connecting justice with a sense of spirituality. So if I love calling myself a Unitarian and I love the community and the traditions, you know, why am I not part of a congregation? I have explored joining one over the years, especially because when I was an older teenager at Don Heights, the congregation was talking a lot about how to engage youth and young adults and young families. And I was part of some of those conversations. And so as I have come into my young adult years, you know, sometimes I think back to those days and I think, why haven't I kept going to service? Because I was very successfully engaged, I think, on a soul level by Unitarian in a number of practices, but the structure of the weekly Sunday services has not been the practice that I've turned to through my 20s, or best reflected the practice that worked best to me at particular points in time. I must imagine this must be true for many people who identify as Unitarian. You find different practices at different points in your life, and it's such a gift to be able to do that. So, you know, as I speak to a few of my own experiences on the journey, you know, I hope it opens space for you too to consider how your practices have evolved over time. You know, when I first arrived to do my undergraduate at McMaster in Hamilton, is where I did my degree, I don't think I consciously fully recognized at 18 that I need a regular spiritual space to feel healthy and whole. But I found myself very attracted to a group called Student Open Circles, this amazing magical group run by a really stupendous couple, Mary Beth and Jeff Drury. It was a non-denominational group that provided spiritual and reflective space on the university campus through events and retreats, but also weekly circles, meditation circle, or I was part of a creativity circle. It was a space that really reminded me of my Unitarian, you know, spiritual reflection spaces I've grown up with. And so as students, we ran the club, but Mary Beth and Jeff Drury, who ran the larger Open Circle charity, were there to mentor and did other work in the community. A part of what worked for me so well about Student Open Circles was that it was on campus at a time in my life where I lived on a university campus, and we scheduled sessions around everyone's class schedule at a time where that really took over, you know, the rhythm of my life. And it also met a real need I had for spiritual space as a student. I don't know whether this term experiential learning or this cycle means anything to anyone here, but it was such a, everybody was talking about it on the university campus when I was at McMaster. Experiential learning, you have a concrete experience, you get a chance to reflect and observe, you abstract it, connect it to like theory, you form a plan, and you have some more experiences. It's such an intuitive process. It's a way of learning that we all do every day. But ironically, the education systems that we live in often get in the way of going through this cycle. And so it was a huge forward-going topic of conversation at McMaster. And this is from Mohawk College, you know, at a lot of educational institutions, how do we let students learn experientially? I think one of the biggest links in the cycle when you're in school, at least for me, was having the space to reflect and observe, because, you know, that's not just thinking, that's reflection and observation involves asking questions that sometimes are spiritual, like, what is the meaning of this? How does this affect this, what I believe about the world and who I am and what my purpose is, and what this earth is and what I'm doing here on it. And, you know, I didn't realize till I left McMaster, but my weekly creativity circle meetings were a really big part of what kept me healthy and sane while I was there. When I left school, I found myself very disoriented about who I was and what I wanted to do. And I went through a period of very high anxiety and I began to really cast around for a space and community that could be healing for me and spiritually grounding. And that is how I found the Watah community. This is a picture of the cohort from the first year I was part of, the Watah Theatre. It was run by an artist named To Be Young, Anita Africa, and it was a magical place. The Watah Theatre still exists, but not as a physical space in Toronto anymore. It focused on Black theater, though it was open to all races. Sometimes people find it surprising to hear that as a white person, I was a member of a Black theater, an artist at a Black theater, but a lot of people of color there in this community and in the art community in general will say that studying main theater in any mainstream institution feels like a study of white theater. And in a similar vein, anyone can study Shakespeare, anybody can study and be part of Black theater in a community like Watah that was open to people of all identities. What was so special about Watah, not only for me personally, it was a place where I discovered that art creation is part of my purpose and also connected to my own spirituality. But Watah had a method. Debbie ran Watah with a methodology that really, above all, honored the inherent worth and dignity of each participant and their search for truth. And I think this was part of the deepest magic of this place. Debbie, as our teacher and mentor, had us all start with reflection on the big questions. What is sacred to you? What is urgent to you? What are the stories that you believe and don't believe? Who am I? What is my purpose? And there was space for honest and truthful sharing of answers to those questions and affirmation of the validity of what you have to say. It's so healing to have a space like that, and really, really beautiful art grew out of that starting point at the Watah Theatre. Watah had some community traditions that I loved, and some of which came from African or Caribbean origins. We would often, every performance or talk at Watah started out with an honoring of the ancestors. Somebody would get 2 bowls, one with water, and people in the audience would call out the names of relatives or sometimes groups or significant political figures who they wanted to honor, and the person with the bowl would pour water into the second bowl for each name, and everyone would say Ashe. It was a kind of prayer of gratitude or sacredness for those who have come before, and was the kind of ritual that turned a space from one where you just were doing a task of art to one where you were practicing something deeper. Watah prompted me to start consciously to make space for artistic creation and spirituality and reflection in the second half of my 20s. And when I look at what I most found and was drawn to, I think it's reflective of the project to project, lease to lease life that I've lived through my 20s. And I think a lot of, there's a group of people in my generation who, you don't expect to necessarily own property as early as previous generations. And people expect and do take contracts rather than long-term jobs. You have this project to project orientation. And I found that when I look at how I've practiced my spirituality, it's often been by engaging in, an 8-month program, a 10-week program with a place like Watah, or that a friend offered, or that a community was offering. You know, there's a precariousness to going project to project, but there's also a real luxury and joy in getting to try so many different things. And I find that habit of engaging with things that have a kind of limited run has carried over to to the spiritual like communities and commitments that I've come into. I've also come to really appreciate activism-oriented groups that intentionally create a spiritual or deep reflective space within them, something I'm sure many people here are familiar with participating in. And one group I've really connected to recently is called Resource Movement, which is an organization made up of young people, generally below 40, who identifies coming from wealth or class privilege. And I participate through the Giving Circle project. The Giving Circle, one of the big goals of Resource Movement is to bring awareness of class and wealth privilege, and also to offer supportive environment for folks to think through the way that they hold their wealth, share their wealth, to rethink. And the Giving Circle in particular raises money for in partnership with a really amazing organization called Groundswell. And the idea is, so the Giving Circle itself, the idea is to fundraise in a supported way and recognize the emotional aspect of fundraising that comes as a fundraiser and as people you fundraise from, but also to create a space to think about making a giving plan, and you know, especially to make a giving plan and really think about how you're redistributing your money and to who, and you know, who gets to make the choices around where money goes. The Giving Circle, Giving Circles exist all over, but Resource Movement's Giving Circle, we fundraise in partnership with Groundswell. And this is something that this was our first Giving Circles, a picture of us. But the fundraising for Groundswell is actually going on right now. And before I end, maybe I will share just a note about them, because I do think Groundswell is a group that aligns very well for me with what I learned from UU. Groundswell funds grassroots organizations that have barriers to gaining mainstream funding. Indigenous, this year they're specifically funding Indigenous and Black-led groups. They do not have charitable status, and they fund, one of the big barriers that groups face to getting funding can be having charitable status. And so Groundswell funds really groups doing really important grassroots change that otherwise might have trouble getting money. And doing this fundraising in a space with Resource Movement that allows like deep reflection, once again, for me, moves an activity that could otherwise be a task that feels meaningful and turns it also into a felt spiritual practice. I grew up with a lot of privileges and gifts, and I really count Unitarian Universalism among them. The centrality of UU principles in my purpose, which guides my core choices around my paid and unpaid work, is massive. I can't imagine a life without it. I hope that listening to some of my reflections on my own UU identity and the spiritual needs of different moments of my life has brought up meaningful memories or reflections for you as well. Thank you.